Picture a lion on the African savanna approximately 2 million years ago. She is watching something from a low ridge, her body flat against the dry grass, her amber eyes tracking a group of small bipedal animals moving across the open ground below. There are approximately 12 of them, moving in the loose but cohesive way that social primates move, not the tight formation of a herd animal, not the fluid individual movement of a solitary predator, but something that reads as coordinated without being mechanical. They are heading toward the same water source she uses every morning. She assesses them the way she assesses everything, through the accumulated behavioral inheritance of a predator lineage refined across millions of years of hunting experience. She is running a threat and opportunity calculation that she does not consciously articulate, but executes constantly, automatically, and with a precision that determines whether she eats or goes hungry, whether she hunts or conserves energy, whether she closes the distance or maintains it. The bipedal animals are small. Adults weigh perhaps 35 to 50 kilograms. They do not have obvious weapons, no horns, no tusks, no impressive natural armament. Their skin is exposed and unarmored. Their top speed is substantially below hers. On paper, against a straightforward physical checklist of prey vulnerability, they should be viable targets. She does not move toward them. This is the puzzle. An apex predator capable of taking down animals 10 times the size of these bipeds, in territory she has used her entire life, looking at something that appears physically outmatched, and making the decision repeatedly, generation after generation of lions across millions of years of African savanna, to leave them alone. Understanding why requires understanding something fundamental about predator decision-making, about what ancient humans actually were as ecological animals, and about a relationship between the human lineage and the carnivores surrounding it that was far more complicated, far more dynamic, and far more reciprocal than the simple narrative of vulnerable early humans cowering from dangerous wildlife suggests. Because here is the truth that the popular version of this story consistently misses. Wild animals saw ancient humans as something far more confusing and ultimately far more threatening than simple prey, and the process by which that threat assessment developed is one of the most revealing stories in the entire evolutionary history of our species. Start with the honest baseline of what ancient hominins actually were physically, because intellectual honesty requires acknowledging what the animals assessing them were seeing before introducing the complications. Australopithecus, the genus of early bipedal hominins that preceded Homo in the African record, was genuinely small by the standards of the megafaunal community it inhabited. Adult males of Australopithecus afarensis, the species that includes the famous Lucy specimen, stood perhaps 1 to 1.5 meters tall and weighed between 25 and 50 kilograms depending on sex and individual variation. Their upper body was relatively strong. Climbing adapted arms carried more muscle than later Homo species would maintain, but their lower body, while capable of efficient bipedal locomotion, was not built for the burst acceleration or sustained top speed that defines successful flight from large predators. Their defensive anatomy was limited by primate standards. No horns, no tusks, no thick hide to complicate a predatory bite. Their fingernails were not functional claws. Their teeth, while capable of processing diverse foods, were not impressive offensive weapons against large carnivores. By the morphological inventory of defensive structures, early hominins were poorly equipped, and the fossil record confirms they were sometimes preyed upon. The Taung child, an Australopithecus africanus specimen found in South Africa, and dating to approximately 2.5 million years ago, shows damage to its eye sockets matching the talon strike pattern of a large African crowned eagle. The paleoanthropologist Bob Brain's analysis of South African cave deposits at Swartkrans and related sites found hominin remains mixed with other prey species in patterns indicating deposition by leopards. The same pattern observed for baboon bones and other prey. Several hominin skulls from these sites bear puncture marks matching leopard canine spacing. Ancient hominins were eaten. This is not speculation or approximation. It is documented in the physical evidence and should be stated plainly. They were prey animals for multiple large carnivore species, including leopards, crowned eagles, large ancestral spotted hyenas, and probably saber-toothed cats. The predation pressure was sustained enough and significant enough to have influenced hominin behavior and social organization in ways that researchers can identify and trace through the archaeological and fossil record. This is the honest starting point. But here is where the story immediately becomes more complicated and more interesting, because even from the earliest periods of their existence, hominins were simultaneously prey animals, and something that their predators apparently treated with distinctly more caution than their physical characteristics alone would rationally warrant. The group defense factor was the first and most immediate complication for any large predator assessing hominin prey. Early hominins were deeply social animals whose group structure was not a loose aggregation, but a functional unit with active collective responses to threats. The group sizes estimated for Australopithecine populations, ranging from perhaps 15 to 50 individuals in a typical social unit, represent a multi-body collective that imposes a completely different threat calculation on an approaching predator than a single prey individual or even a pair. Modern chimpanzees demonstrate what primate group defense looks like in practice. Chimpanzees are not apex predators. They lack the physical equipment to reliably kill leopards, the primary cat predator in their forest environments, in one-on-one confrontation. And yet, documented observations of chimpanzee-leopard encounters frequently show the leopard retreating from a cohesive chimpanzee group that has detected it and is actively mobbing, multiple adult individuals simultaneously approaching, vocalizing loudly, throwing objects, and pressing forward in a coordinated harassment that imposes unpredictable, multi-directional threats on the leopard simultaneously. The leopard, which could kill any individual chimpanzee it caught alone, retreats because the multi-body threat exceeds its cost tolerance. An attack into a coordinated group means exposure to injury from multiple directions without the certainty of securing prey. The expected benefit does not exceed the expected cost, and the leopard disengages. Early hominins with equivalent or superior social cohesion, and their social brains were already considerably more complex than chimpanzee social cognition, would have presented the same multi-body deterrent to approaching predators. A lion or leopard that approached a group of 12 to 30 hominins was not approaching one slow, weaponless prey animal. It was approaching a collective unit whose behavioral response to predator detection was coordinated, loud, and imposing enough in its multi-directional nature to exceed the predator's comfortable cost threshold in most realistic scenarios. The vocalizations of early hominins in predator response contexts communicated threat status not just to group members, but inadvertently to the predator itself. A group that has detected a predator and is actively alarm calling is a group that has lost all value as a hunt target for any predator relying on surprise and ambush, which describes most large cat predators and many other carnivore species. Detection eliminates the ambush advantage, and a prey group that responds to detection with collective, coordinated alarm behavior, rather than individual flight, is imposing additional costs by maintaining formation rather than scattering into individually pursuable units. The predator's rational response to a detected, vocalizing, cohesive hominin group is to disengage and wait for a better opportunity. An isolated individual, a distracted juvenile, a group member separated by injury or distraction. This opportunistic predation targeting isolated or compromised individuals rather than cohesive groups explains the pattern of hominin predation in the fossil record, which is consistent with selection of vulnerable individuals rather than coordinated group attack. Now introduce the technological factor, which appears early in the genus Homo and represents a qualitative change in the threat profile that hominins presented to predators. A change that the physical appearance of a small, slow biped does not telegraph in advance. Stone tools first appear in the archaeological record approximately 3.3 million years ago in Ethiopia. The Lomekwian tools. Though more sophisticated Oldowan tools are documented from approximately 2.5 million years ago and are associated with the earliest members of the genus Homo. The primary documented use of these tools is food processing, butchery of large animal carcasses, marrow extraction from long bones, plant food processing. But a stone flake that can process a carcass is also a sharp projectile, And the cognitive capacity to shape stone into a useful tool is the same cognitive capacity required to throw a shaped stone with accuracy and intent. The throwing capabilities of early Homo represent one of the most significant and least appreciated of the many evolutionary innovations in the human lineage. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Modern humans are extraordinary throwers by any primate standard. The only primate capable of generating the combination of velocity and accuracy that makes throwing a genuine distance weapon rather than a simple intimidation display. This capability reflects specific anatomical evolution in the shoulder joint, the elbow, and the wrist, a throwing mechanics system that was developing in early Homo populations alongside brain expansion and tool manufacture. A predator approaching a group of early Homo individuals encountered incoming projectiles before it closed to contact range. The impact of a thrown stone at 20 to 30 meters delivers meaningful kinetic force, enough to cause acute pain, to bruise muscle, to fracture smaller bones if the impact is direct. It does not require a lethal impact to function as an effective deterrent. A carnivore that has taken a rock to the face or shoulder while approaching at 20 meters has received a clear and unambiguous cost signal at a range where no benefit was possible from the approach, and the behavioral conclusion: this approach is not worth attempting, is immediate, specific, and durably retained. The critical feature of projectile defense from the predator's threat model perspective is that it is categorically outside the behavioral parameters of any prey species the predator's evolutionary history has prepared it for. Prey animals bite and kick and gore when cornered. This is within the predator's cost model, expected, manageable. Prey animals do not throw things at approach range with accuracy and force. The human projectile response is a genuine behavioral anomaly in the predator's threat assessment system, and the resolution of anomalies in behavioral cost-benefit assessment tends toward increased caution rather than increased approach. Combined with the group defense context, multiple individuals simultaneously throwing projectiles from multiple directions, the collective human response to predator approach would have imposed costs on approaching predators that rapidly exceeded any expected benefit from the encounter in most realistic scenarios. The practical result was strong and consistent selection pressure against predators that pressed approaches to human groups, producing carnivore populations in human-occupied territories that showed elevated avoidance distances around human groups specifically. The fire dimension introduces a qualitative discontinuity in the human-predator relationship that has no parallel in any other prey-predator relationship in natural history. Fire control, the deliberate maintenance of fire as a managed resource, appears conservatively in the archaeological record at approximately 400,000 years ago, with evidence suggesting Homo erectus fire use potentially extending back considerably further. For the purposes of understanding predator-prey dynamics, the specific date matters less than the effect. Every large mammalian predator in hominin environments evolved in a world where fire was an uncontrolled, episodic, climatically driven phenomenon. Lightning-ignited grassland fires, volcanic activity, natural combustion events that animals responded to with flight and avoidance. The fire avoidance response in large mammals is not primarily learned from individual experience, but is deeply embedded in behavioral inheritance, reflecting millions of years of selection against fire approach behavior. Animals that approached natural fires were animals that died in them. The inherited behavioral response to fire is therefore avoidance rather than investigation, and this response is not easily overridden by individual experience. Ancient humans controlling fire created a biological paradox for every large predator in their environment. Fire was something to avoid. Every inherited behavioral program said this with physiological emphasis. Fire was now associated with the same prey animals whose threat profile had already been elevated by projectile throwing and group defense. The combination was a behavioral category that predators had no framework for and no evolutionarily inherited strategy to address. The resolution, across the vast majority of predator prey encounters involving fire using humans, was avoidance of the fire associated animals. Human groups with maintained campfires were, from the large predator's behavioral perspective, fires. Things to circle at cautious distance, to monitor opportunistically for detached individuals, but not to approach and engage directly. The nocturnal predator threat that would have been most acute for sleeping human groups was substantially mitigated by fire, eliminating or drastically reducing the advantage that darkness provided to ambush predators. Now move from the predator assessment of humans to the prey animal assessment, because this perspective provides some of the clearest evidence for how ancient animals responded to the human lineage and what that response tells us about the ecological position humans actually occupied. Prey animals continuously assess predators in their environment and adjust behavior based on that assessment, in ways that are measurable and that persist as evolved traits when the selection pressure is maintained long enough. Animals that have never encountered a particular predator show no appropriate avoidance response to that predator. The behavioral wariness is not innate in the absence of evolutionary history with the specific threat. This principle explains why island megafauna encountered by the first human colonists showed no flight response to approaching humans. Their evolutionary history included no human predation, so no inherited wariness existed. Continental African megafauna tell a completely different story. Elephants, rhinoceroses, Cape buffalo, hippopotamuses, and the full suite of large African herbivores show dramatically elevated human wariness responses compared to equivalent animals on other continents or on islands colonized recently. Their flight distances from approaching humans are greater. Their threat assessment of human presence is faster. Their collective defensive responses to human proximity are more immediate and more coordinated. This elevated wariness in African megafauna is the behavioral and evolutionary trace of millions of years of selection pressure imposed by human hunting on African prey populations. The ecological logic is straightforward. Prey animals that showed appropriate wariness of human hunters, maintaining greater flight distances, responding more quickly to human approach, coordinating defensive behavior more efficiently in response to human presence, survived encounters with human hunters at higher rates than prey animals with less appropriate wariness. Over generations, African prey populations accumulated inherited behavioral wariness toward humans that is observable, measurable, and directly attributable to the sustained selective pressure of human predation. You do not evolve heritable behavioral wariness of a predator unless that predator kills enough of you across enough generations to generate meaningful selection pressure for avoidance. The prey side of the African megafauna record therefore provides compelling independent evidence that ancient humans in Africa were effective enough predators to impose significant selective pressure on large herbivore populations. Predators significant enough in their ecological impact to shape the behavioral evolution of multiple prey species. This is simultaneously evidence that wild animals did not see ancient humans as simple prey, and evidence that ancient humans were sufficiently effective predators to be taken seriously by prey species with evolutionary histories spanning millions of years. The picture is one of an animal that occupied a complex, ambiguous, and increasingly potent ecological position, neither helpless prey nor unchallenged apex predator, but something that kept shifting towards the apex end of the spectrum through technological and social innovation at a pace that prey populations could adapt to through behavioral evolution, but that ultimately outpaced those adaptations through the accelerating sophistication of human technology. The scavenging competition between ancient humans and the large carnivores of African savannas provides another perspective on how the animal community assessed the human lineage. Access to large animal carcasses was a critical resource in Pleistocene savanna ecosystems, and multiple species competed for this resource. Spotted hyenas, lions, leopards, crocodiles at water-adjacent kills, and various bird species with access to the interior of carcasses that mammalian competitors had opened. Early hominins entering this competitive scavenging ecology were participating in a resource competition with animals substantially larger, faster, and more physically formidable than themselves. The evidence from sites like Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania shows cut marks from stone tools on large mammal bones overlapping with carnivore tooth marks in patterns that researchers have used to reconstruct the sequence of access. In some cases, cut marks underlying tooth marks, humans first, carnivores later, and in other cases, the reverse, carnivores first, humans accessing the carcass after primary consumers had departed. The evidence of human first access at some carcasses in the Olduvai record is remarkable given the formidable competition. It implies that early Homo was capable of securing primary access to large carcasses, fresh kills with the highest nutritional value, in competition with lions and spotted hyenas. The mechanism that would allow a small hominin group to secure first access at a large kill against competition from Africa's most formidable carnivores is exactly the combination of group cohesion, vocalization, projectile throwing, and, where available, fire that has been described above. A noisy rock-throwing group of hominins approaching a fresh kill site was imposing costs on feeding carnivores that, in at least some cases, exceeded those carnivores' tolerance threshold for competition. The specific behavior of modern hunter-gatherers approaching lion kills to scavenge. Documented ethnographically among the Hadza of Tanzania, who will approach active lion kills and use noise and presence to drive lions off partially consumed carcasses, demonstrates that this competitive displacement of large carnivores by coordinated human groups is not hypothetical, but is a documented functional behavior that small-bodied humans with no technological advantage beyond coordination and noise can execute effectively against Africa's apex predators. The full picture that assembles from all of these perspectives is of ancient humans occupying a wildly unusual ecological position that confounded the threat assessment systems of every animal that interacted with them. They were physically small and apparently vulnerable. Standard prey morphology. They were socially cohesive in ways that imposed multi-body collective defense costs on approaching predators. They threw things at predators from distances that no other prey species utilized. They eventually controlled fire. They hunted prey species large enough to impose selection pressure toward human wariness on those species' behavioral evolution. No animal in the African savanna or in any other environment that ancient humans occupied had an accurate, calibrated threat model for what humans actually were. The category that existing predator threat assessment frameworks provided, small prey animal, was wrong in ways that became apparent only at the cost of painful experiences with the human group's defensive response. The category that prey animal threat frameworks provided, medium-large generalist predator, was also wrong in ways that became apparent only after multiple predatory encounters. Ancient humans were a novel ecological entity that existing animal assessment frameworks consistently underestimated, and the consistent underestimation came at consistent cost to the animals doing the underestimating. The lion on the ridge did not move toward the group of hominins at the water. Her hesitation was the product of evolutionary history she carried in her behavioral inheritance. The cautious assessment of something that the predatory calculus said should be prey, but that something more fundamental and less articulable was flagging as uncertain. She watched them drink. She waited. She would find easier targets later. The hominins, meanwhile, had seen her the moment she moved into position. Two of the adults at the group's edge had already turned to face her direction, shifting their weight, their hands finding stones from the dry ground without any deliberate decision, just the automatic threat response that their own evolutionary history had built into them just as thoroughly as the lion's hunting behavior was built into her. If she came closer, they would not flee. She seemed to know this. It was written somewhere in the behavioral inheritance of her lineage in letters that individual experience had only confirmed. She stayed on the ridge. The hominins moved on. Nobody attacked anyone. This happened every day, everywhere these species coexisted for millions of years. A continuous negotiation of threat assessment and cost calculation between a lineage of animals that the rest of the ecosystem consistently underestimated and a surrounding animal community that was slowly, generation by generation, learning not to. That learning, pressed into behavior through the selection pressure of expensive encounters with groups that threw rocks, maintained fire, and refused to scatter, is how wild animals eventually learned to see ancient humans as exactly what they were. Not weak, never weak. Something considerably more difficult than that.